Welcome back to the Review Den, my friends. And yes, I do feel the need for speed. Thank you very much.
Bingo, Maverick's dead. You're out of there, kid.
It's actually pretty interesting. Just as the true F-14 Tomcat movie isn't Top Gun, it's the final countdown, the true Top Gun video game isn't a Top Gun game. It's Afterburner. We covered Space Harrier and Outrun, but now the year is 1987, where Sega arcade technology has the power to scale, rotate, and draw enough sprites to realize the jet fighter game that Space Harrier may have originally been penned as. Enter Yu Suzuki AM2 Studio and a secretive new Sega Project 128. Now, at this point, Yu Suzuki had wanted to make more of a Studio Ghibli steampunk-style flight game, but to give the game more of a Western appeal and to capitalize on the massive pop culture sensation of Top Gun, it was reimagined into the military flight combat game we know and love. We need to set the table, though. See, Top Gun is in a really weird place as far as video games go. The movie was a massive blockbuster. That cannot be understated enough. Despite my criticisms, and believe me, we'll get into them someday, credit where credit is due, the movie took something as academic as flight combat schooling and turned it into a brilliant popcorn flick. No, it wasn't some niche movie like a rom-com or a horror flick. This was something everyone was packing the theater to see. It wasn't about flight envelopes, missile ranges, or rules of engagement. This was pure testosterone, handsome machismo, shaky, exciting close-ups, drama, and of course Cold War military porn. So yes, there is no doubt that it is an art form to take something like military training and transform it into a silver screen epic. And the results spoke for themselves. Navy recruitment jumped over 500%, aviator sunglasses became all the rage, and the F-14 Tomcat became the face of United States air power to fans across the world. Rightly so. But for video games, this presented a problem. Established themes like shooting bad guys or driving race cars were relatively easy to distill down to a mass-market arcade title. For action or shooting games, players simply pointed their character at the enemy and attacked. Simple as. And driving games were free of any advanced physics, so even children understood the basics of turning left and right. But flight is by nature a complex concept. Adding that tricky third dimension to the equation opens an entire library of concepts and problems that all interact with each other. Gravity, drag, weight, lift, angle of attack, thrust, not to mention avionics and combat, are far too complex for the average moviegoer wandering into the mall arcade. And even simplified flight games such as the Ace Combat series require at least a basic understanding of the fundamentals. And this is why most, not all, the NES games actually kind of nailed it, but this is why most officially licensed Top Gun games never achieved blockbuster status. They usually tried to slot themselves between Ace Combat and a typical shmup. Too simplistic for Simcade fans, but too complex for a non-gaming moviegoer. They would split the difference and wound up pleasing nobody. No, if a flight game were to achieve a mass-market breakthrough, it would require someone who could distill the elements of the subject, flight combat, down to an understandable and marketable experience the way Jerry Bruckheimer and Tony Scott did for the silver screen. Enter Yu Suzuki and Sega. Suzuki was not only a good programmer, he had a knack for simplifying an exciting subject into its simplest and best parts. He also had the habit of testing the waters of what he was getting into, such as his European road tour for Outrun, and here was no different. This time, Suzuki visited an airbase in Florida to take part in some simulated combat, and it must have left quite the impression. It's been said that a fighter pilot's life is some 90% routine and boredom, and 10% pure unimaginable adrenaline. And it's this 10% that made its way into Afterburner. There's no boring procedure as in traditional PC flight sims or the detached, distant God's eye view of traditional shmups. This is pure in-your-face action. Like Space Harrier, this is third person, right behind the character, only now with the mighty Tomcat taking on endless waves of enemy fighters. Everything about traditional flight games was removed and replaced with a constant into-the-screen action. The only movement the player had to worry about was sliding around the screen to lock up enemies while avoiding their missiles. Again, this may all seem common to modern gamers, but back in the 80s, the whole concept of third-person action gameplay was incredibly fresh. And heck, even by today's standards, this game is fast. Now, some cool features added on top of the Space Harrier formula are the lock-on missiles and the throttle, or speed control. Your guns are unlimited, though unlike Harrier, they are much more difficult to score hits with. But by moving around the screen and dragging the targeting cursor over enemies, you lock them up for your missiles. It's pretty clever actually. Just like Maverick and the gang, you'll need to find that lock-on before sending missiles away. But you need to balance this with avoiding enemy shots and not running out of ammo. Mind you, this whole dance between offense and defense is occurring at an incredible pace, and it's pretty satisfying when you finally reach that sweet spot and stay alive. This is where the Afterburner itself comes into play, and the whole reason this game is called Afterburner 2. See, Afterburner has a really convoluted family tree. When most people think Afterburner, they think this game. But there actually was an Afterburner 1. At first glance, it looks exactly like this game, and it mostly was. But when first released to Japanese arcades, Afterburner didn't have any speed controls. This made enemy missiles much more difficult to avoid, and it kept the pace actually kind of slow. So the team went to work revising the game, and just 3 months later, they released it again as Afterburner 2. Music, levels, and enemies were lightly reworked, but most important, it now had the throttle control with the titular Afterburner. Sure, you could lope around at the basic speed, but why do that when you could throttle up, blast the burners, and twist and dodge around enemy fire? One little addition made all the difference to the game, which may be why they called what can be considered a game patch now a full sequel. If you ever wondered what became of Afterburner 1, well, now you know. But this here is the Afterburner we know and love. Incredibly fast with butt-kicking action, graphics, and music. It may not have the official name, but there is no doubt this is the true Top Gun video game. Sega knocked it out of the park with this one. The rest of the Afterburner and Top Gun games are all fun in their own ways, and believe me, I've got them on the list, but Afterburner 2 is a video game icon. Gee, I wish I knew where to look for all those arcade-perfect ports of the game so I could play it myself. Well, strange-looking tall man from an awful sci-fi film, I've got you covered. Just as with Space Harrier, we have a runner-up with the Sega 32X, and it's Afterburner Complete. Not sure why they named it that, but this is the first close-to-arcade-perfect port of Afterburner 2. Unfortunately, it suffers from a janky frame rate compared to the silky smooth arcade 60 frames per second, but it's still fully playable and another impressive entry into the 32X's, shall we say, limited library. Next, we have the Sega Saturn turning in another great port with their Sega Ages release. Unlike just about everyone else, though, I do have to point out an issue that keeps it from being arcade perfect. The ground attack levels do seem to bog down a little bit. It's not a game killer by any stretch, but I gotta be honest and point it out. If you get the Japanese version, you do get some remixed music options though, and that is very cool. The Dreamcast release actually wound up being the best, smoothest experience in my experience. There's no slowdown in the ground attack stages, and the sprites look extra crisp. You won't find any extra options or bonuses here, it's just the basic experience. But it's pretty much arcade perfect. Strangely, this isn't found in any Yakuza games, at least not yet, but it is found in the Shenmue HD collection, so modern Microsoft and Sony fans won't miss out. And lastly, we have the mighty 3D Classics Edition for the 3DS. Just as before, AM2 put a lot of work into rebuilding these games for Nintendo's handheld, and it shows. Not only are there a bunch of extras, which I'll get to in the bonus content video, but the core game is perfect. The new widescreen option looks beautiful, and the motion cabinets are always a favorite of mine. The only downside is this was never brought to the Switch, which is odd. In fact, Afterburner is a bit rare on modern systems. Like I said, Space Harrier and Outrun are in several Yakuza games, but only the Shenmue HD collection carries this for modern gamers, unless you count emulation. However you play it though, Afterburner 2 is worth a shot. This was Sega's first big blockbuster. It's no mistake it shows up in a few movies in the 80s, and there's no doubt it was influenced by a blockbuster movie to begin with. Hollywood and video games usually don't mix very well, but this game proves there's always an exception. Thank you all so much for watching. I appreciate each and every one of you, and if you'd like to help my channel grow, maybe watch some of my other videos. I'll be back soon with another review, and no matter what, be sure to keep going, even when things get tough, because you are worth it.